The Church of St. Cuthbert's had stood at the edge of Ashvale for 400 years, and in all that time, no one had ever interrupted a wedding before the vows were spoken. Constance Fallow stood at the back of the nave in her best gray gown, which was not gray by choice, but by the slow bleaching of too many washes in cold water. And she held a small bouquet of white garden roses she had cut herself that morning, because the bride's family could not afford a florist. She was the vicar's daughter. She had arranged the flowers on the altar. She had polished the silver candlesticks until they caught the October light coming through the east window. She had done these things because they needed doing, and because the bride, Miss Nettie Farrow, was her friend, and because Constance Fallow had learned very young that the world ran on the labor of women who were neither thanked nor seen. The church was full. Ashvale was a village small enough that a wedding drew everyone in it, and today's congregation included most of the county besides, because today's bridegroom was Mr. Gerald Hapwell, the eldest son of Sir Lionel Hapwell of Hapwell Park, and the Hapwells were the nearest thing this corner of Northamptonshire had to local royalty. Sir Lionel sat in the front pew with his back very straight. Beside him sat Lady Hapwell, whose diamonds were conspicuous for a morning ceremony, and whose expression suggested she found the entire proceeding beneath her, but intended to endure it with grace. And beside Lady Hapwell, newly arrived from London and reportedly staying only until Thursday, sat the Earl of Ashford. Constance had not known he would be here. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a change in the weather before you can name it, a stillness at the edge of her vision. She did not look directly. She arranged the last rose in the brass holder beside the lectern, and smoothed the linen, and told herself she had tasks to complete. His name was Edmund Severn, the Earl of Ashford, and she had seen him once before, 3 years ago, when he had come to speak with her father about the church's roof. He had been brisk then, efficient. He had looked through her in the way that men of his station often did, not unkindly, but with the simple certainty that she did not require acknowledgement. She was the vicar's daughter. She was a fixture of the church, like the candlesticks. No one thanked a candlestick for being present. The congregation settled. The organ began. If you have ever watched a woman wait for something she has decided she does not want, you know the particular stillness of her hands. Gerald Hapwell walked to the altar with his chin up and his eyes forward, and he was handsome enough, and he smiled at no one in particular, and Nettie Farrow came through the doors on her father's arm in white muslin with a wreath of dried flowers at her temple. The congregation made the collective sound of appreciation that weddings require. Constance pressed herself against the wall beneath the window and held her hands together and watched her friend walk toward her future. The vicar, her father, Reverend Fallow, opened his prayer book. And the door at the back of the church opened again, and someone came in. The Earl of Ashford rose from his pew. Not slowly. Not with the mannered deliberateness of a man performing an interruption. He rose as a man rises when he has made a decision and has run out of time. Constance watched his face from across the nave and saw nothing in it that she could name. Only a jaw held so tightly the muscle at the corner of it was visible from 15 feet away. "Reverend Fallow," he said. The word landed in the silence like a stone in water. Her father looked up from his prayer book. "I would speak with you," the Earl said, and his voice was level, the way a road is level before it drops. "Before you proceed." What happened next was something the village of Ashvale would discuss for the next 6 months. Constance Fallow would discuss it for the rest of her life. She did not know yet what it meant. None of them did. She knew only that the Earl of Ashford's eyes, crossing the nave as he walked toward her father, had stopped on her face for one long, unreadable moment, and then moved on. And that she had felt it, that pause, in the center of her sternum. Constance had grown up in the vicarage attached to St. Cuthbert's, which meant she had grown up in a house of 2 rooms, comfortable warmth, and 8 rooms perpetual cold, with a father who was gentle and learned and entirely absent from the practical management of his household, and a mother who had been equal to that task until 6 years ago. When she had died of a fever that a warmer house might have been able to fight, after that, Constance had managed the house herself. She was 23 years old now. She had been managing it since she was 17. She was not unhappy. That was the thing people did not understand when they looked at her situation and made their assessments. She had her father who was kind. She had her garden which was productive. She had the church which was beautiful in the early morning when no one else was in it, and the lending library in the village which she visited every Thursday, and her friendship with Nettie Farrow, who had been her closest companion since they were girls, and who had always seen her clearly, and whom she was about to lose to Gerald Hapwell and whatever life Nettie intended to build inside it. She was not unhappy. She was simply not seen. To Ashvale, she was just a useful woman. Kind Miss Follow who arranged the flowers, and organized the harvest supper, and visited the sick and returned library books for the elderly, capable and quiet and plain, though she was not plain. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and a quality of stillness that was sometimes mistaken for dullness by people who had not been still long enough themselves to recognize it for what it was. Lady Hapwell had once described her, in Constance's hearing, as the sort of girl the village cannot do without and will never notice. It was the sort of remark that arrives like a small cold blade between the ribs. Constance had not flinched. She had excused herself, walked to the garden, and spent 15 minutes pulling weeds with unnecessary force. Then she had gone back inside, and finished helping with the arrangements for Lady Hapwell's harvest dinner, because they had needed finishing, and she had said she would finish them. She did not think of herself as long-suffering. She thought of herself as practical. She was also, though she would not have said this aloud, quietly furious, not at any person in particular, at the machinery, at the assumption that her presence was a given, and her worth was a service, and her attention would always be available, because what else would she be attending to? She had no suitors. She had no prospects. She had the church, and the garden, and the lending library, and the Earl of Ashford had looked at her in the nave of St. Cuthbert's with that long, unreadable pause, and she did not know what it meant, and she told herself firmly that it did not matter. The reason it did not matter was simple. She had been looked at before in that particular way, and the looking had never led anywhere except eventually away. Her father had called her to his study that evening, the evening of the interrupted wedding, after the guests had dispersed and Gerald Hapwell had left the church with a face like a man walking to his own execution, and Nettie had been taken home in quiet distress. And the Earl of Ashford had remained for nearly an hour in closed conversation with Reverend Fallow, and then departed without speaking to anyone else. "Sit down, Constance," her father said. She sat. "I must tell you something," he said, "and I must ask that you hold it in confidence until it can be properly addressed." She said she would. What her father told her was the following. Gerald Hapwell, 3 months before his wedding to Nettie Farrow, had contracted a private debt of £700 to a moneylender in Northampton, and had secured it, without his father's knowledge or Nettie's family's knowledge, against the settlement intended for Nettie herself. If the wedding proceeded, Nettie's portion would pass directly to the moneylender upon the signature of the marriage contract. Nettie would enter her marriage with nothing, and the Hapwells would be legally obligated for a debt they did not know existed. The Earl of Ashford, who is a trustee of the Hapwell family estate by virtue of a long-standing arrangement with Sir Lionel, had learned of it only that morning, 2 hours before the ceremony, when a letter arrived from the moneylender's solicitor, making the terms explicit. He had ridden to the church to prevent a woman from walking into a trap. Constance sat very still and listened to all of this, and felt something shifting in her chest that she could not immediately name. "He came," she said. "Yes," her father said. "He did not know her," she said. "Not well. And he came." Her father looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. He said, Reverend Fallow told her carefully, that it would have been unconscionable not to. She walked home from the study to the kitchen and stood at the window, looking out at the garden in the dark, and the cold glass was very close to her face, and she did not cry, but her hands gripped the sill in a way that left marks. If something is quietly growing in your chest, and you are very determined not to examine it. You know the particular discipline of that attention, and how expensive it is. The following 2 weeks were occupied with the practical consequences of the interrupted wedding. Nettie Farrow was in a state of quiet devastation, which was understandable and which Constance attended to as best she could, arriving each morning with bread and sitting with her friend through the long, slow work of coming to terms with what Gerald Hapwell had done. The Hapwell family was in a state of private upheaval. Sir Lionel had retired to his study. Lady Hapwell had issued a series of pointed remarks to anyone who would receive them, to the effect that the Earl's interference, however legally justified, had been unnecessary, and the matter might have been handled with less public spectacle. She said, Nettie reported one afternoon, her voice flat and careful, that the interruption was worse than the debt, that the embarrassment could have been avoided. She paused. She said you were involved somehow. That you had told your father and your father had told the Earl. Constance set down her cup. I told no one anything. I knew nothing about the debt before your wedding morning. I know, Nettie said. I told her so. She did not appear to believe me, the remark. She understood was Lady Hapwell's. The insinuation that Constance Fallow, the vicar's daughter, the useful woman, had somehow maneuvered herself into the center of this situation for motives that were not entirely transparent. It was the sort of insinuation that Lady Hapwell delivered as a question, so that no one could object to it directly, and which spread through a small village the way cold water spreads through a cloth. She did not answer it. There was nothing to answer that would not dignify it. She returned to the vicarage and weeded the garden with the same unnecessary force she had applied to it before, and when she went inside she sat at her mother's writing desk and opened the arithmetic of her father's household accounts, and she worked through them until the numbers were steady and she could breathe again. The Earl of Ashford was still in Ashvale. He had not left Thursday as expected. He had not left the following Thursday either. She learned this from the butcher's boy, and from Mrs. Pelham at the lending library, and from her own father, who had twice been called to Hapwell Park for what Reverend Fallow described only as ongoing discussions, and from whom she could extract no further detail. She saw the Earl on a Tuesday morning outside the lending library. He was standing at the edge of the road with a letter in his hand, and she was coming out of the library with 3 volumes pressed against her chest, and there was no way to pretend they had not both seen each other. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than courtesy required. Miss Fallow, he said. She said his name back, my lord. He said, Are you well? It was not quite a question. His voice did not lift at the end of it. It arrived level and low like everything he said, and she did not know if he was asking because he expected an answer, or because the form of civility required it. Quite well, she said. Thank you. Your father tells me you manage the vicarage accounts. She looked at him. He tells everyone, she said, which was not a complaint, only a fact. Something altered in his expression. Not a smile. Something quieter than that, and quicker. I wondered, he said, and he seemed to consider his next words with the same care she suspected. He applied to everything, whether you might be willing to do something with those competencies that would benefit your friend. She did not move. Miss Farrow's settlement, he said. The legal question of whether it can be recovered from the moneylender is not straightforward. I have solicitors working on it. They lack certain documentation that existed only in correspondence between the vicarage and the Farrow family, because your father was the original party to the settlement agreement when it was drawn up 5 years ago. She understood immediately. Her father's filing system was, charitably, a system in only the most aspirational sense. I can find it, she said. I believed you could, he said. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her in the church, that quality of attention she could not name, as though he was seeing something the rest of the room had neglected to look for. She held the 3 library books more tightly and told herself it was the cold morning air that had put warmth in her face. She found the correspondence in 4 hours, organized it, copied the relevant passages in her own clear hand, and sent it to the Earl with a covering note that explained precisely which letters predated the moneylender's claim and why. He sent back a note of 2 lines. The first thanked her. The second said, with no preamble, that it was the clearest piece of legal organization he had encountered in 6 months of dealing with solicitors, and that if she was ever in need of a reference for employment in any capacity that required such competence, she had only to ask. She read the note 3 times. Then she put it in the drawer of her mother's writing desk and sat for a moment with her hands folded on the surface of it, and did not permit herself to make anything of it. He came to the vicarage 2 days later. He stood in her father's study and she sat in the chair by the window where she had sat for the accounting books, and he explained the progress of the legal case, which was progressing, and which her documentation had materially advanced, and he spoke to her father, but he was also speaking to her, and she knew it, and she said nothing about it. He came again 4 days after that. Her father was not in. She told him so. He said, "I know. I saw him leaving from the lane." She looked at him. He did not look away. "May I come in?" he said. She ought to have said no. The propriety of it was questionable. A single woman receiving a gentleman in her father's study in her father's absence. She knew the rules. She had lived inside them her entire life, faithfully, and without complaint, because they were the container that everything ran in, and she was a practical woman. "Yes," she said. He came in and sat in her father's chair, which was slightly too small for him, and she sat in the chair by the window again, and he told her that the moneylender had agreed to a negotiated settlement, and that Nettie Farrow's portion would be returned intact within the month, and that Sir Lionel had been persuaded, with some difficulty, to acknowledge his son's conduct and to make a formal apology to the Farrow family. "She will be all right," Constance said. "Yes," he said. "You did not have to do any of this." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the late October garden was stripped bare by a night's rain, the last of the roses gone. She had not had time to cut the dead canes. "My wife," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said, in the voice of a man reciting something he has had to learn to say aloud. "She died because I was not paying sufficient attention, not to her, to the things that pressed on her, the obligations she carried, the silence she kept because she did not wish to burden me, and I did not ask with sufficient care to hear past that silence." He paused. The muscle along his jaw was visible again. "I have not been easy to know since then. I am told it is one of the more polite ways of describing it." She looked at her hands. "I came to this wedding," he said, "because I was a trustee, and because it was my obligation. I did not come expecting anything else." He did not look at her when he said the next thing. He looked at the window, at the stripped garden. "I saw you in the church, arranging the roses before the ceremony began. No one else was looking at you." She was very still. "I noticed," he said, "because I have spent 4 years watching the small labor of maintenance that keeps the world in order, and the people who do it without acknowledgement, and the specific quality of someone who does it not to be thanked, but because it needs to be done." He looked at her then. "You are not performing it," she said slowly. "No." "I know the difference," he said. "If you have ever been seen clearly by someone who is not supposed to see you, you know the particular vertigo of that moment. It does not feel like triumph. It feels like the ground shifting under very ordinary feet." She said carefully, "You should not tell me this." "No," he agreed. "We have spoken perhaps 4 times. 5, he said, and something in the precision of it undid her composure by a small but significant amount. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "My lord," she said, "I am the vicar's daughter. I have no fortune and no connections, and my entire social existence consists of a lending library card and a good relationship with the butcher's boy. Whatever you intend by this attention." "I am not suggesting anything," he said. "I am telling you that I see you. That is all." The fire had burned down to coals. The room was very quiet. "That is not all," she said, because she was, in the end, a practical woman who did not lie. He said, "No, it is not." Lady Hapwell arrived at the vicarage on a Friday morning, unannounced, and found Constance in the garden, cutting dead canes from the rose bushes with a tool that was good for the roses, and something of a relief to beholding. Lady Hapwell wore a pelisse the color of dark wine, and walked across the garden path with the confidence of a woman who had never in her life been told she was not welcome somewhere. She stopped at a distance that made conversation possible while keeping mud from her boots. "I shall come to the point," she said. "The Earl of Ashford has been visiting this household with a frequency that is beginning to attract comment." Constance set down her cutting tool. "Has it?" "I am sure your father has no objection," Lady Hapwell said, with the particular inflection of a woman who is certain of no such thing. "And I am sure you are sensible of the honor such attention implies. You must also be sensible of the practical realities. Lord Ashford has a great estate, and a position in the county that requires a particular sort of establishment. He has been careless of that position since his first wife died, but he will not be careless of it forever. When he comes to his senses, he will require a woman of appropriate standing," Constance said, "and that woman is not me." Lady Hapwell looked at her with an expression that was almost kind. "You are a good woman, Miss Follow, useful and capable and well regarded. The village would be quite at a loss without you." She paused. "That is precisely the reason he will not choose you. Men of his rank do not marry the woman the village cannot do without. They marry the woman the season requires." It was, Constance admitted to herself, a more honest version of the sentiment than she usually received. Lady Hapwell was not cruel. She was simply, with perfect confidence, explaining the order of things as she understood them. "I appreciate your candor," Constance said. "I thought you would," Lady Hapwell said. "You are a sensible girl." She left the way she had come. Constance stood in the stripped garden, with her cutting tool in her hand, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she thought about sensible girls, and about the machinery that ran on them. She went inside and wrote a letter. The letter was not to the Earl. It was to a family in Bath who had written to her father in August, asking for a recommendation for a household companion, a woman of education and good character, to assist an elderly widow. She had set it aside at the time. She had set it aside because there had been no urgency, and because leaving the vicarage had seemed like loss rather than choice. She read the letter from Bath again and saw it differently now. She was 23, she was capable and educated and entirely practical. She could make a life from those things. She had always been making a life from those things. The question was only whether she had the courage to choose it, rather than fall into it. She wrote back to Bath. She said she was available. She told her father that evening. Her father looked at her over his spectacles for a long time. Then he said, "You have not spoken to Ashford." "No," she said. "He came again this afternoon," her father said. "You were in the garden." "He did not stay, but he left a note. It is on my desk." She did not go to read it that night. She read it the following morning, before she could lose her resolve to not read it, which was a different and more expensive resolve than it should have been. It said in his even, precise hand, "I have been asked by my man of business to remain in London through November. For reasons connected with the estate, I find I am not inclined to go. I have not examined why with any thoroughness. I thought you should know." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and walked to the lending library, and returned her 3 books and selected 3 different ones, and walked home. She planted the bulbs she had been putting off planting. She made her father's dinner. She sat at her mother's writing desk and opened the household accounts, but the numbers blurred and she closed them again. She thought about what it meant to need nothing from a person, and still want them to stay. She thought about Nettie, who had nearly walked into a disaster with her eyes open and her heart trusting, and no one to tell her the floor had been removed. She thought about Lady Hapwell's quiet certainty that the world was organized correctly, and Constance Fallow's place in it was fixed. She took the Earl's note from her apron pocket, and read it again. "I find I am not inclined to go." She sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she wrote to Bath, and withdrew her application. She did not tell herself it was because of the note. She told herself she was not ready to leave her father's house. She told herself it was practical. She was lying to herself and she was aware of it, and she continued anyway, because some choices need to be approached sideways. The harvest supper at Haphole Park had been arranged for the third Saturday in November, and no one had thought to cancel it despite the disruptions of the previous weeks, because harvest suppers did not cancel. They happened in the way the harvest itself happened, out of necessity and custom, and the community's collective need to come together and eat and agree that the year was survivable. Constance arrived early, as she always did, to help with the arrangements. She had made 3 pies and a pudding, and had carried them herself because the weather was dry. She was setting out the pudding in the kitchen when Lady Hapwell came in. "Still here," Lady Hapwell said, and it was not addressed to anyone in particular, but Constance knew, and the cook knew, and the footman by the door knew, and everyone in the kitchen who had ears knew who she meant and what she meant. The useful girl, still present, still arranging. Constance set the pudding carefully on the table and smoothed her apron and said nothing. "I did speak to the family in Bath," Lady Hapwell said. "They mentioned they had received an inquiry, and then a withdrawal. I thought it was very like you." "Did you?" Constance said. "It is a particular kind of foolishness," Lady Hapwell said, not unkindly, only with the confidence of a woman who had never been wrong about this sort of thing, to withdraw from a sensible opportunity on the strength of a note. The cook was extremely busy with a pot of something. The footman had found urgent business with the wall. Constance picked up the empty basket and looked at Lady Hapwell with the directness that she had always possessed and had never been given much occasion to use. "How do you know about a note?" she said. Lady Hapwell's composure adjusted slightly. "I know because Edmund Severn told his godmother, who is a friend of mine, and who told me, because she too has concerns about the direction of his attention." "Then perhaps," Constance said, "you might direct your concerns to him." She walked out of the kitchen before Lady Hapwell could respond. The supper was already assembling in the great hall. Constance set her basket against the wall and looked for her father, and found him in conversation with the vicar of the next parish, and she stood near the fire because she was cold, and because she needed a moment to breathe and to quiet the racing of her pulse. The Earl of Ashford was across the room. He was standing with Sir Lionel, listening, and his posture was the posture of a man enduring a conversation he had not sought. And he looked across the long room full of firelight and voices and the smell of roasted meat, not past her, not in her direction, at her. She looked back. She looked back because she was finished with looking away. Lady Hapwell arrived in the doorway behind her. She heard the footstep, recognized it. The supper guests were still gathering. There were perhaps 40 people in various states of arrival, and the room was loud with it, and Lady Hapwell said, in a voice carrying enough for its nearest neighbors to hear, "There she is!" Still underfoot as always. I do not know how she manages it. Some women simply cannot take a sensible hint. It landed the way these things land. A lull in the conversation near her. A few turned faces. Nutty Farrow, who had come with her family, looked up from across the room with an expression that was both outraged and afraid. Constance stood very still. She had been still before. She knew the practice of it. She had been still through 4 years of small cold blades, and the machinery of condescension and the particular efficiency with which her world had chosen not to see her. She was very good at still. The Earl moved, not dramatically, not in a way that required announcement. 3 strides across the room, deliberate and quiet, and he was beside her, and his hand was at her elbow, not holding her, simply present. And he looked at Lady Hapwell with an expression that contained nothing theatrical and everything necessary. "Miss Follow," he said, not to Lady Hapwell, to her, his voice low and level, "I have been waiting for an opportunity to speak with you." The room was doing what rooms do. Attending, he did not raise his voice. He turned toward her fully the way you turn toward a person who is the only person in the room, and he said, "I should have written more plainly. I did not go to London because I did not wish to go to London. I stayed because there are things in Ashvale that matter more to me than anything that requires my attention elsewhere." "Lady Hapwell," said Edmund, "this is not the time." "I am going to ask Miss Fallow," he said without looking away from Constance, "whether she will honor me by allowing me to call on her father tomorrow, with his permission and hers. I intend to pursue an understanding." He paused. The muscle at his jaw was steady. His eyes were steady. He said as though the room were not full of witnesses, as though it were only the two of them. In the stripped October garden, "Miss Constance Fallow, will you have me?" It was not 12 words. It was not a speech. It was plain, and it was specific, and it named her exactly. The room held its breath. Nettie Farrow, across the hall, was pressing her hand to her mouth. Lady Hapwell's fan had ceased its motion. Constance looked at the Earl of Ashford, whose eyes were still on hers, whose hand was still at her elbow, not holding. Only present, waiting for her answer with the patience of a man who had spent 4 years learning, at significant cost, that silence was sometimes the sound of something worth waiting for. She said, "You may call on my father tomorrow." And then, because she was a practical woman and not a foolish one, she added, quietly, so that only he could hear, "Though I should warn you that his filing system is in a terrible state, and he will almost certainly offer you seed cake from last April." The thing that crossed his face then was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to one that Nettie Farrow, who was watching, thought later that it was the most significant expression she had ever seen on a man's face at a harvest supper. The supper proceeded. The room reassembled itself around what had just happened, with the efficient absorption that gathering crowds have always managed. Lady Hapwell spoke to her neighbor. Sir Lionel refilled his glass. The vicar of the next parish made a joke that no one particularly laughed at. Constance ate something and tasted nothing, and was aware of exactly where the Earl was in the room without looking. The November that followed was the sort of November that Northamptonshire produces with particular dedication. Cold and gray and given to sudden, hard frosts that killed what the October rain had spared. The garden at the vicarage was thoroughly stripped by the middle of the month. The lending library smelled of damp. Her father's study was cold enough that she wore her heaviest shawl to do the accounts. The Earl called on her father on the Sunday after the harvest supper, as he had said he would, and her father offered him seed cake from last April, and the Earl ate it without expression. And Reverend Fallow gave his blessing with such speed and visible relief that Constance suspected her father had been aware of the situation considerably longer than he had let on. After that, there were calls that were proper and witnessed, and walks on the estate grounds that were chilly and pleasant, and accompanied at a discreet distance by her father's elderly spaniel, who had never chaperoned anything in his life, and was uncertain of his responsibilities. There were conversations that ranged further than she had permitted herself to imagine, about books and accounts, and the management of the church, and the particular qualities of late November light on Northamptonshire stone. He was not easy to know. He had not lied about that. He had a habit of going very quiet, that initially read as withdrawal, and gradually revealed itself as the habit of a man who said only what he meant, because he had learned to find words costly. She had the same habit, for the same reason, and she recognized it in him, the way you recognize something you have always known you were looking for without ever having named it. She told him about her mother one afternoon on the estate road, not the whole of it, only the shape of it, the cold house and the practical management and the 6 years since. He listened in the way he listened, which was entirely without inserting himself, without offering a resolution that was not his to offer. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, without looking at her, "You have been carrying a great deal." She said, "It was mine to carry." He said, "Yes, and you have carried it without complaint and without loss of yourself, which is not a small thing." She was quiet for a long moment. Beside her, the spaniel investigated a stone wall. "Your wife," she said. A pause. "Eleanor," he said. "She would have liked you." It was offered carefully, without drama, as a fact he had examined and confirmed. She understood that it cost him something to say it, and that he said it because it was true, and because the truth in this case was more generous than silence. "Tell me about her," she said. He did. They walked another half-mile while he told her, and the November light fell gray and clear across the frozen fields. And by the time they turned back toward the vicarage, she understood the shape of his grief. Not the whole of it, but the outline. And she had a better sense of what it had cost him to come to that church, and to stay in Asheville, and to eat her father's April seed cake, and to look at her across a harvest supper as though she were the only fixed point in a room full of motion. She told Nettie that evening. Not all of it. Enough, Nettie said. He is very serious. Yes, Constance agreed. You are also very serious. I am practical, Constance said. Nettie made a sound that was affectionate and skeptical in equal measure. You are not, she said. You are practical in the way he is. Quiet. It is a very good disguise for a person who feels everything. Constance folded her hands and said nothing, which Nettie had always known meant she was right. They were engaged formally by the end of November. The announcement in the vicarage parlor was a small occasion. Her father stood visibly moved. The Earl was grave and careful, and watching her face as he slid the ring onto her finger as though she were something that might still disappear. Herself, breathing more quickly than was warranted for a practical woman. The ring was his mother's, a small sapphire set in gold, which he had carried in his breast pocket for 6 weeks, he told her, which explained the quality of attention he had brought to every occasion they had spent together, and which undid entirely, and without apology, the last of her well-maintained composure. She cried, briefly, with her face turned away. He said, Constance. It was the first time he had used her name without a title preceding it, and it arrived in exactly the way her friend had predicted it would. She turned back to face him. He said quietly, I would very much like it, if you were not unhappy. I am not unhappy, she said. I know, he said. I have been paying attention. Lady Hapwell came to call the following week. She arrived in the same dark wine pelisse, and she sat in the vicarage parlor, and she accepted a cup of tea, and she said, with a brevity that Constance respected even as she noted it, that she wished them well, and that she was sorry for certain observations she had made at the harvest supper which had been imprecise. Constance said, Thank you. She meant it. Lady Hapwell was not a villain. She was a woman whose categories had not, until recently, included a person like Constance Follow. I told my godson, Lady Hapwell said, with a slight press to her lips, that it was the least I owed. Nettie Farrell recovered her settlement by December. She wrote to Constance from her mother's house that she had burned Gerald Hapwell's last letter without reading it, which she reported with a calm that Constance recognized as the particular calm of a woman who has just put something down and will not pick it up again. She said she intended to have a very good winter, and possibly a better spring. The wedding was in March. St. Cuthbert's had never looked so well. The spring flowers on the altar were white and yellow, and the early light through the east window fell across the nave in long gold ribbons, and Constance stood at the altar, and was not cold in her cream wool gown, with the new ribbon at the waist, which Nettie had helped her choose, and which she had paid for herself from 6 years of careful household accounting. Her father cried from the first word of the service, which she had anticipated, and for which she had supplied him with a handkerchief. The Earl said his vows in the voice she had come to know, level and low and meaning exactly what it said. She said hers in a voice that was steadier than she had expected, because she had decided some weeks ago that she was done with half measures, and she meant what she said, and the church was not a place for lies. He put the ring back on her finger and looked at her with the quality of attention she had first noticed in that very nave 6 months ago, when she had been arranging roses and no one had been watching. She looked back. She had gotten quite good at that. The spring came in that year with unusual warmth, and the vicarage garden, which was now also a garden she visited rather than a garden she inhabited, came back with a generosity that felt like comment. The roses she had planted for her mother bloomed early. She cut a small bunch and brought them to the church and set them in the brass holder by the lectern, because they needed cutting and because the church was still beautiful in the early morning. Edmund found her there on a morning in early April, and he leaned against the door frame of the nave with his coat collar turned up against the cool air and watched her arrange them, and did not speak until she had finished, because he had learned, or perhaps had always known, that some things are done best without interruption. She turned and found him watching. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" she said. "Look to see if you have been seen," he said, and then looked surprised. She considered this. Outside the east window the village was beginning its morning, and the light was the particular gold of early April, which is its own kind of mercy. "I am still adjusting," she said. He pushed off the door frame and walked toward her, and his hand was at her elbow, still in the not-quite-holding way he had always had, and she understood now that the not-quite-holding was the habit of a man who was extremely careful with what mattered to him, and that it was its own kind of tenderness. "Take your time," he said. She set the last rose in the holder and smoothed her sleeve and looked at the altar, which she had polished and arranged and cared for since she was old enough to hold a cloth. The brass candlesticks caught the morning light. The white roses opened to the warmth. She was not a fixture. She had always been seen. It had only taken the right person to say so, quietly, in a room full of people who had stopped looking. If you stayed for Constance's story, leave a word in the quiet below. Thank you for being here. The candles burned on long after the church had emptied, and the light held, and the roses opened, and the morning continued in the way that mornings do when something has finally come right.